probably one of the most recognizable pieces of military fashion within the peace movement within the 1960s and 70s, or otherwise known as the hippies, was what John Lennon was sporting most famously, but plenty of other disgruntled veterans from the war which had come back. And films like Forrest Gump do a beautiful illustration of seeing the OG 107 utility shirt being worn in civilian life. Now, John Lennon's one's quite interesting in itself. He has a couple of patches on there, some denoting rank, and also the other one which has got a chieftain on it, which was a patch that was issued to soldiers who had done 20 patrols across the DMZ. Interesting little tidbit. There were three main versions of the OG 107 uniform. The first version came out in 1952 and was pretty much produced for an entire decade, used up until 1963, but it's very common to see it past that point. And ironically, it's probably the most prevalent one in Vietnam War photos that you'll see around. Supply lines being what they are, especially with conflict, definitely take a while to phase things out. Second version came out in 1963, only was around for a single year. There really wasn't much change to it. There was a slight difference in the cut and the pockets. That's about it, but it's probably the most rarest one, so if you ever managed to see one of those, I'd probably snap one out there if you're a collector. The Type 3 came out in 1964 and in part served for decades and decades, not just through the Vietnam War, but afterwards. There were several differences that came in with them. They started having pointed pockets. They started using dulled plastic buttons, just like the jungle fatigue uniform, not to be confused. And also had the removal on the waist tabs on the trousers as well, and a difference in the sizing system. In 1967, frontline units that weren't special forces started getting issued the tropical jungle fatigues as well. Now, they didn't completely phase out the uniform. The other ones are still being produced, although having said that, once the change in 67 came along, most of that uniform would start being worn stateside. A second iteration of the third pattern came out in 1975 at the closing of the Vietnam War, well after the US direct involvement had pulled out in 1973. The real main difference that came with this was they transitioned from full cotton in the previous versions, and this one had a mix of 50-50 polyester and cotton, which necessitated a change in their version of the OD colour. So it's called the OG 507. Now this would go on to serve right until 1989, until the Woodland BDU came in. But the uniform didn't stop there, not just with the war or the hippie movement, but it continued to see service in other countries backed by America, or was copied by other countries as well, especially in the Middle East and through South America as well. Being an OD uniform, it didn't exactly identify with any one country, so it's pretty utilitarian in name, of course. But here in Army and Outdoors, we finally managed to snag a, well, almost full uniform, the shirts and trousers in OG 507. Now, the previous versions, although there's a lot of them produced, are becoming harder and harder to get, especially since a lot more of them saw combat service, whereas the OG 507, well, the war was done by then, and mostly seen just barracks duty at stateside. So they're in fantastic condition for surplus. And yeah, for the collectors out there, an interesting part of history, but also a kind of a fashionable item tying back to John Lennon and some of the other people of his time. So for all you John Lennon types, or maybe the opposite, we've got a whole bunch of these up in Army and Outdoors at the moment. So head up to the bio, look at our latest arrivals, and get one while you can.